The coffee maker clicked off by itself. Ethan Cole didn't move right away. He never did. The small green light blinked on, signaling completion, but Ethan remained still, one hand resting on the cool edge of the counter, waiting an extra second, long enough to be sure nothing unexpected followed. No spill, no sharp noise, no disruption, just silence. Mornings were easiest when they behaved this way. Predictable, contained, the kind of quiet that made it feel like life was under control, as long as nothing tried too hard to interrupt it. Ethan poured the coffee carefully, wiping the rim of the mug before lifting it. He took a cautious sip and winced, then reached for the sugar, even though he'd told himself he wouldn't. It was a small promise, the kind you broke without consequence. He carried the mug toward the window, the city stretching out below him in clean, distant lines. From this height, everything looked manageable. Traffic moved where it was supposed to. People entered buildings with purpose. Nothing demanded explanation. The apartment was immaculate. Neutral walls, minimal furniture, nothing sentimental enough to argue back. That, too, was intentional. Ethan had learned early that spaces could hold memories the way people did. He preferred places that didn't ask him who he'd been yesterday, or he intended to become tomorrow. He owned versions of this apartment in other cities, spaces designed for efficiency, not attachment. What unsettled him that morning wasn't the quiet. It was the feeling that he was waiting. The thought came and went quickly, but not before leaving behind a faint unease. He glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there, as if his mind had skipped ahead without telling him. No one was there. He checked his phone. Messages from colleagues, calendar reminders. A flight scheduled later that week. He barely remembered booking. Everything was accounted for. He told himself that was enough. He poured the rest of the coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and placed it upside down on the rack. Waste was preferable to disorder. Order was how things stayed manageable. Ethan believed that if you organized your life carefully enough, you could avoid disappointment. It was a belief that had carried him far. Across town, Marissa Lane folded napkins at the cafe with quiet focus. She lined the edges carefully, smoothing the fabric with her palm before stacking them beside the register. She'd been doing this long enough to know no one noticed napkins. Still, she folded them as if they mattered. Her mother used to fold letters the same way. Letters she never mailed, but never threw away either. Marissa had picked up the habit without realizing it, the way certain gestures passed down before the stories attached to them did. The cafe smelled like espresso and cinnamon, warm and familiar. It was the kind of place that asked little of you if you showed up consistently. Marissa liked that. Predictability meant she could move through her shift without defending her choices or explaining her future. She didn't like questions that reached too far ahead. A couple sat by the window, leaning toward each other as they talked, laughter soft and unguarded. Marissa glanced at them briefly, then turned away, not because it hurt, but because it reminded her of something she'd learned the hard way. She had once believed that calm meant permanence. That if something felt easy, it would last. When that relationship ended, not with shouting or betrayal, but with quiet withdrawal, it taught her a lesson she hadn't fully unlearned. Comfort could disappear without ever announcing its exit. The bell above the door chimed. Marissa looked up automatically. The man who stepped inside didn't draw attention to himself. That was the first thing she noticed. He wasn't dressed to impress, but his clothes fit well, chosen carefully. His coat was dark, slightly damp from the weather. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room as if committing it to memory. Marissa felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Not traction, awareness. He met her eyes briefly and nodded before approaching the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice practiced but warm. "Morning," he replied. His tone was even, calm, not performative. "I'll have a black coffee," he said, then paused. "And whatever pastry people regret the least." Marissa smiled despite herself. "That's a narrow margin. I'm comfortable with risk," he said lightly. She handed him a small plate with a blueberry scone. He thanked her and took a seat at the counter instead of one of the empty tables. Close enough for conversation, not close enough to intrude. They didn't speak again for several minutes. Marissa restocked the sugar jars. The man stirred his coffee slowly, watching the steam rise as if it might reveal something if he paid enough attention. The silence between them didn't feel awkward. It felt intentional. "Finally," he said, "you fold those like they matter." She glanced down at the napkins in her hands. "They might, to someone." He nodded, as if accepting that without question. "That makes sense." It was a small exchange, nothing that demanded attention, and yet Marissa felt it settle somewhere inside her, the way certain moments did when they carried more weight than they should have. Ethan left the cafe a few minutes later, holding the door open for someone behind him, even though they were still several steps away. Marissa watched him go without meaning to. He didn't look back. That shouldn't have mattered. Still, later, when the cafe grew quieter and the morning rush faded, Marissa found herself straightening the napkins again, even though they were already neat. Across the city, Ethan sat in the back of a car, answering emails in complete sentences, his voice measured as he took a call he didn't need to enjoy. He did what was expected of him. He always had. And yet, as the city passed by outside the window, he found himself thinking of a woman who folded napkins like they mattered. Neither of them knew it yet, but that ordinary morning, the coffee, the routine, the careful habits, had already begun to shift something neither of them had planned to change. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough to matter. Marissa didn't expect to think about him again. That was the first thing she told herself when the cafe door closed behind the last customer, and the quiet settled back into place. She wiped down the counter, counted the register, stacked chairs with the same practiced rhythm she used every day. Routine was reliable. Routine didn't linger. And yet, while she worked, her mind kept drifting. Not to his face, exactly, but to the way he'd waited before moving. To the patience in that pause. To how he'd noticed something most people overlooked and spoken about it without irony. You fold those like they matter. The sentence returned with an odd persistence. Marissa locked up and stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter as the evening air brushed against her skin. The city was slipping into night. The sidewalks less crowded, the noise less performative. She liked this hour best. It felt honest, less interested in impressing anyone. As she walked home, she caught herself replaying the morning in fragments, as if her mind were testing the memory for meaning. She told herself not to overinterpret. She'd learned what happened when you assigned weight too quickly, when you built expectations out of moments that hadn't agreed to carry them. Still, she wondered, briefly, cautiously, whether he would come back. Ethan spent the rest of the day exactly as planned. He attended meetings where people spoke in polished sentences and avoided saying anything they couldn't revise later. He approved decisions that would affect thousands of people without ever touching their lives directly. He listened more than he spoke, a skill he'd refined over time, not because it made him wiser, but because it made him harder to read. By late afternoon, he felt the familiar pressure settle behind his eyes. Not stress, not exhaustion, something quieter, a dull sense of repetition. He left his office earlier than usual and rode the elevator down alone. The mirrored walls reflected a man who looked composed, confident, unbothered. Ethan studied that reflection, the way one might study a photograph taken years ago, accurate but detached. Outside, the city moved around him with practiced urgency. Without fully deciding to, he gave the driver an address that wasn't home. The bell chimed again the next morning. Marissa looked up on instinct, her body reacting before her mind could follow. When she saw him standing just inside the doorway, coat buttoned neatly, something in her chest loosened and tightened at the same time. He noticed her reaction, not the emotion itself, but the shift. His mouth curved into a faint smile. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady. He approached the counter, taking the same seat as before, as if it had quietly been assigned to him. She poured his coffee before he ordered it, catching herself only after the cup was already in her hand. "Same as yesterday?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "That's all right. It is." They fell into silence again, but it felt thinner this time, more aware of itself. Like both of them knew it could be filled if either chose to. "I didn't expect to come back," Ethan said, eventually. Marissa glanced at him. "Why not?" "Because I don't usually return to places that make me notice things." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. She wiped the counter slowly, buying herself a moment. "Noticing isn't always dangerous." "No," he said, "but it can be inconvenient." That made her smile. "Convenient how?" He considered the question. "It disrupts the story you tell yourself about who you are." Marissa leaned against the counter. "What story is that?" "That I'm someone who's already figured things out." She met his eyes, curious now. And are you? He shook his head. I'm someone who's very good at appearing that way. The honesty surprised her, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't framed for sympathy. He stated it like a fact, not a confession. That sounds exhausting, she said. It can be, he replied, but it's also comfortable. She understood that immediately. Over the next few days, Ethan returned without announcement. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the late afternoon. Never enough to feel intrusive, but often enough to feel intentional. Their conversations grew slowly, organically, the way trust did when it wasn't rushed. They talked about the city, how it felt different depending on the hour, about routines they'd inherited rather than chosen, about the strange way certain memories sharpened over time while others blurred. They didn't talk about their past relationships directly. Not yet, but the shape of those histories made themselves known in what they avoided. Marissa noticed Ethan's careful phrasing, the way he spoke in complete thoughts, but rarely in absolutes. Ethan noticed Marissa's precision, how she chose words that fit rather than impressed. One afternoon, during a lull, Ethan asked, "Do you ever feel like you've organized your life around preventing disappointment?" The question startled her, not because it was intrusive, but because it felt accurate. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I think I learned early that expectations were fragile things. And so you stopped building them?" "I stopped building them publicly," she corrected. "Privately is harder." He nodded, understanding more than she'd explained. "I think I did the opposite," he said. "I built a life that exceeded expectations, so I wouldn't have to deal with anyone else's." Marissa studied him. "Did it work?" "For a while," he said, "until it didn't." One evening, after closing, Ethan waited while Marissa locked up. "I can walk you home," he said. "If you'd like." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They walked side by side, not touching, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. The neighborhood was imperfect. Cracked pavement, mismatched buildings, windows glowing unevenly. Marissa liked it because it felt lived in. "So," she said, "what do you do when you're not disrupting your own routines?" Ethan smiled softly. "I fund things." She glanced at him. "That's vague. It's intentional." They walked a few more steps before he added, "I invest in companies, projects, occasionally ideas, and occasionally people." She asked. "Rarely," he said. "People are unpredictable. So are ideas," she pointed out. "Yes," he agreed, "but ideas don't ask you to show up emotionally." That stopped her. She looked at him then, not searching, just seeing. "And people do." "They do," he said. "That's the part I'm still negotiating." They reached her building. The moment stretched, neither of them rushing to end it. "Thank you for walking me," Marissa said. "Thank you for letting me Ethan replied. She watched him leave, noticing the absence of anxiety in herself. No rush of expectation. No sudden fear of loss. Just awareness. That night, Marissa lay awake longer than usual. She thought about how easy it had felt to talk to him, how safe the silences had been, and how dangerous safety could become if mistaken for permanence. She reminded herself that this was still the beginning, that beginnings were fragile, that clarity mattered more than hope. Across the city, Ethan stood at his window, city lights reflecting faintly in the glass. He thought about the life he'd built around control, and the subtle discomfort that had begun to accompany it for the first time in a long while. He didn't reach for distraction. He sat with the thought that some ordinary moments didn't just pass. Some of them waited, and whether you noticed or not determined what came next, the days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither of them named. Ethan didn't announce when he was coming anymore. He simply showed up, sometimes early, sometimes just before closing, his presence becoming familiar without turning predictable. Marissa noticed that he never checked his phone while he was there. Not once. When he sat at the counter, he was fully present, as if the rest of his life existed somewhere else and could wait its turn. That, more than anything, made her cautious. People who knew how to disappear usually also knew how to reappear only when it suited them. She didn't accuse him of that. She just paid attention. One afternoon, during a quiet stretch, Marissa asked, "Do you ever get tired of being needed?" The question slipped out before she'd fully decided to ask it. Ethan looked at her, surprised. "Why do you ask?" "Because people who fund things usually do it because someone needs something from them," she said. "That can turn into a role." He considered that. "It did," he admitted, "for a long time. And now I'm not sure who I am when no one's asking." Marissa nodded slowly. "That can be disorienting." "Yes," he said. "It can also be freeing." She didn't disagree, but she knew freedom without grounding could become another kind of avoidance. They began walking together more often. Not every night. Not on a schedule. Just when it happened naturally. The city around them felt less hurried when they walked side by side, as if the pace adjusted itself to match their conversation. One evening, as they passed a row of older buildings, mid-renovation, Ethan slowed. "I helped fund this project," he said, almost to himself. Marissa stopped beside him. "This one?" "Yes. Affordable housing. The neighborhood council had been trying to get it approved for years." She waited, sensing there was more. "I don't usually mention things like that," he added. "It changes the way people look at me." "How so?" "They stop seeing me," he said, "and start seeing what I can do for them." Marissa studied him carefully. "You didn't have to tell me." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." The words landed with weight. "So, you're wealthy," she said, not accusing, not impressed, just acknowledging the reality he was placing between them. Yes, how wealthy. He exhaled. Enough that it makes most conversations complicated. Marissa absorbed that quietly. She thought of past jobs, cleaning apartments, that looked more like museums than homes, of men who wore humility like an accessory. This doesn't change who you are, she said after a moment, but it does change how careful we need to be. Ethan nodded. That's fair. They continued walking, the silence between them thoughtful rather than strained. The first real distance appeared without warning. Ethan missed 2 days in a row. No message, no explanation. Marissa told herself it didn't matter. He hadn't promised anything. This wasn't a pattern yet. People were allowed to have lives. Still, when the bell chimed on the 3rd day and it wasn't him, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one she'd learned to recognize as memory rather than present danger. She remembered how absence used to arrive quietly, how it dressed itself up as busyness, how it waited for her to stop asking questions. That night, she didn't text him, not because she didn't want to, but because she wanted to see what he would do. Ethan returned on the 4th day, looking slightly less composed than usual. I should have said something, he said as soon as he sat down. Marissa kept her voice even. You didn't have to. But I noticed. I was traveling, he said. Meetings came up unexpectedly. I figured. He looked at her closely, and I wondered whether this was how it would start, she said calmly. The disappearing without explanation. He didn't flinch. That's fair, he said, and it's exactly what I'm trying not to repeat. Trying isn't the same as choosing, she replied. He nodded. I know. The honesty steadied her. I don't need constant access to you, she said, but I do need context. Otherwise, my mind fills in the gaps. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing that. I've spent most of my life letting silence do the talking. And how has that worked out? He smiled faintly, efficiently. Not well. They sat there, the lesson unspoken but clear. Clarity prevents unnecessary pain. Silence invites it. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became more intentional. He didn't overcorrect. He didn't promise more than he could give. But he communicated where he was going, when he'd be gone, when he'd be back. Small things, ordinary things. Marissa noticed how much that mattered. Not because it guaranteed anything, but because it allowed her to stay present instead of vigilant. Still, there were moments when she caught glimpses of a life she wasn't part of. Calls he stepped away to take. Invitations he declined without explanation. A guardedness that returned whenever his public world brushed too close to this quieter one. She didn't confront him immediately. She waited. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. A formal event. Fundraiser. Black tie. Optional. His name printed prominently at the top. Ethan hadn't mentioned it. Marissa found out accidentally, overhearing a conversation between two customers who recognized his name and spoke about him with a mix of admiration and entitlement. That night, when Ethan walked her home, she held the invitation in her hand. "You didn't tell me," she said. He stopped, looked at it, then at her. "I didn't know how," he admitted. "That's not an answer," she said quietly. "That's avoidance." He sighed. "That world doesn't feel real to me, but it exists," she said. "And you exist in it." They stood there, the space between them, no longer neutral. "I was afraid," he said, "that if you saw all of it, you'd only see the distance." Marissa's voice was steady. "I'm more afraid of being edited out." The words landed hard. Neither of them raised their voice. Neither stepped away. This wasn't chaos. It was consequence, and both of them knew the next choice, whatever it was, would shape everything that followed. If this chapter felt familiar, if you've ever noticed how the smallest habits can hide the biggest emotional truths, take a moment to like this video. It helps this story reach others who might need it. And if you want to continue with Ethan and Marissa, because what begins quietly will soon be tested by what's left unspoken, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. The next chapter reveals how silence can slowly become distance. The first sign that something had shifted wasn't dramatic. It was the way Marissa started noticing time. Not the hours on the clock, but the spaces between things. The pause before Ethan answered a question. The half-second where his expression changed before settling back into calm. She noticed how quickly her own mind filled those spaces, how easily memory stepped in to explain what the present hadn't yet confirmed. She didn't like that about herself. It reminded her of who she used to be. Ethan came into the cafe later than usual that week, the day after the conversation about the invitation. He looked composed, as always, but there was a restraint to his movements that hadn't been there before, as if he were carefully managing not just what he said, but how much of himself he allowed to surface. Marissa handed him his coffee without comment. They sat in silence, longer than usual. "I didn't go," he said finally. She looked up. "To the event?" "Yes." "Why?" He considered the question. "Because I realized I'd already made a choice. I just hadn't acknowledged it." "And what choice was that?" "To stay where I was understood," he said, "instead of where I was impressive." Marissa absorbed that, resisting the urge to let it soften her too quickly. "Understanding doesn't mean immunity," she said. "It just means responsibility." "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." They didn't resolve anything in that moment. They weren't supposed. The conversation wasn't about reassurance. It was about recognition. And recognition, she was learning, was the beginning of accountability. Later that evening, Marissa walked home alone. Not because Ethan hadn't offered. He had. But because she needed the quiet. She needed to hear her own thoughts without the influence of his presence. Needed to check whether what she felt was clarity or simply relief. The street lights flickered on as she walked, one by one, illuminating familiar cracks in the sidewalk. She thought about how easily people mistook proximity for commitment. How often she'd stayed in relationships because someone was nearby, not because they were present. She didn't want to do that again. By the time she reached her building, she had made a decision. Not about Ethan, but about herself. She would pay attention, not with suspicion, with honesty. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in the back of his car, watching the city pass by without registering much of it. He hadn't lied when he said he didn't go to the event. What he hadn't said was how difficult that choice had been, not because he wanted to attend, but because declining it forced him to acknowledge something he'd spent years avoiding. He had built his life around optional intimacy. Everything important was scheduled. Everything personal was compartmentalized. Relationships fit neatly into the margins between obligations, never allowed to interfere with the structure that kept him functional. Marissa didn't fit there. That realization didn't feel romantic. It felt destabilizing. He wondered how many people he'd lost without ever technically leaving them. How often he'd mistaken autonomy for emotional distance. How easily he justified silence by calling it discretion. For the first time, he didn't excuse it. Their conversations began to change, not in content, but in texture. They spoke more directly now, less circling, less testing. When Marissa asked questions, Ethan answered them without polishing the response first. When Ethan hesitated, Marissa didn't rush to fill the space. One afternoon he asked, "Do you think people can change patterns they've relied on their entire adult lives?" "Yes," she said, "but only if they stop benefiting from them." He smiled faintly. "That's the difficult part. Growth usually is." The educational truth lingered beneath the moment. Change doesn't begin with desire. It begins with discomfort. The luxury of Ethan's world crept closer without announcement. It showed up in small ways: an unfamiliar car waiting outside the cafe, a phone call he took in a lowered voice, a subtle shift in his posture when certain names came up. Marissa noticed these things without commenting, filing them away not as accusations, but as data. She remembered how easily she'd once ignored data in favor of hope. Not this time. One evening, as they walked, she said, "You live in two worlds." He didn't deny it. "Yes, and you think you can keep them separate." "I think I've been trying to." She stopped walking. "That's not the same thing." He turned to face her. "No, it isn't." They stood there, the city moving around them, both aware that the tension between those worlds was no longer theoretical. This wasn't about a mouth. It was about visibility. "Which world do you feel more like yourself in?" she asked. Ethan answered without thinking. Here the word hung between them. "Then why does the other one keep pulling you back?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "Because it rewards me for being distant." Marissa nodded. "And this one? It asks me to stay." Neither of them spoke after that, because sometimes the most important lessons weren't delivered through explanation, but through the silence that followed truth. As they resumed walking, both understood something had been named that couldn't be unnamed. The quiet beginning was over. What followed would require intention. And intention, unlike habit, demanded choice. Ethan didn't realize how much effort it took to remain divided until he began trying not to be. Before, compartmentalization had felt natural, almost virtuous. Work here, silence there, emotion carefully rationed, so it never interfered with function. It was how he had survived attention, expectations, and the quiet pressure of being useful to too many people at once. But once Marissa had named it, 2 worlds, the separation stopped feeling invisible. It started to feel deliberate. He noticed it in himself first, in the way he adjusted his voice when he answered certain calls, in how his shoulders tightened when his driver mentioned schedules instead of places, in the reflex to protect information that no one had actually asked him to give. That reflex had always felt like wisdom. Now it felt like fear. At the cafe, Marissa watched him more closely than before, not suspiciously, but attentively. She'd learned that distance didn't always announce itself through absence. Sometimes it arrived through subtle changes in presence. Ethan was still there, still listening, still calm. But calm, she now understood, could be curated. One afternoon, as she wiped the counter near his seat, she said, "You're quieter than usual." He looked up. "That bad?" "It depends," she said. "Are you resting, or are you retreating?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was curious. Ethan took a moment before answering. "I think I'm deciding what I'm willing to lose." Marissa stopped wiping. "That's a dangerous way to frame it." "How so?" "Because it assumes loss is inevitable," she said. "Sometimes the real question is what you're willing to change." He absorbed that slowly. Educational truth settled between them, unspoken but present. People often choose loss over change because loss feels familiar. That evening, Ethan walked her home again. The city felt louder than usual, as if the world were insisting on being acknowledged. They walked in step, neither rushing, neither drifting too far apart. "I've spent years protecting myself from expectation," Ethan said. "I thought that meant I was being careful." "Now?" Marissa asked. "And now I think I was just being unavailable." She nodded. "There's a difference." They stopped outside her building. The moment stretched, not romantically, but deliberately. "I'm not asking you to merge your worlds," Marissa said. "I'm asking you not to disappear between them." Ethan met her gaze. "I don't want to. Wanting isn't the same as knowing how," she replied gently. "No," he agreed, "but it's a start." That night, alone in his apartment, Ethan stood at the window longer than usual. The city below felt less distant than it once had, not because it had changed, but because he had stopped using distance as insulation. For the first time, he acknowledged something quietly, but honestly. If he kept choosing comfort over clarity, he would eventually lose both. Marissa had learned not to confuse effort with consistency. It was an old lesson, one she'd paid for in smaller heartbreaks that never looked dramatic enough to warn her ahead of time. People tried all the time. Few stayed aware long enough to change. Ethan was trying. That mattered. But she watched to see if he stayed. He began telling her things before she asked. Where he was going, how long he'd be gone, when he'd be back. Not as reports, as context. The difference was subtle, but important. Context invited trust. Still, there were moments when his other life brushed close. A woman once came into the cafe asking for him by name. Polite, confident, familiar in a way that suggested proximity rather than intimacy. Ethan excused himself and spoke to her outside. When he returned, his expression was neutral again. But something had shifted. Marissa didn't ask who she was. She asked, "Did that conversation cost you something?" Ethan looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Yes." "What?" "Distance," he said, "from a version of myself that was easier." Marissa nodded. Easier isn't always healthier. "I'm learning that," he replied. The educational truth deepened. Growth often feels like loss because it removes coping mechanisms that once worked. Days later, Ethan invited Marissa to walk with him somewhere new. Not a restaurant, not an event, a construction site. "This is one of the projects I told you about," he said. "Housing." She looked around at the unfinished structure, the exposed beams, the uncertainty of it all. "Why show me this?" "Because it's unfinished," he said. "And because it doesn't pretend to be elegant yet." Marissa studied him. "That's honest." "So is this," he said quietly. "I don't want you to only know the polished version of my life." She felt something steady settle inside her. Not excitement, not relief. Alignment. But alignment didn't erase risk. That night she said, "If this ever becomes too much, if you start hiding again, I won't chase clarity from someone who avoids it." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't reassure. He said, "That's fair." And for the first time, Marissa believed him. Not because of his words, but because he didn't resist the boundary. As they stood there, surrounded by something still being built, both understood the lesson unfolding between them. Love wasn't proven by grand gestures. It was proven by whether someone stayed visible when hiding would be easier. Marissa didn't trust sudden peace. She trusted patterns. That was the quiet education life had given her. Peace that arrived too quickly, often left just as fast, while patterns revealed themselves whether you wanted them to or not. So when Ethan began showing up with more consistency, she didn't relax into it. She observed it. He arrived when he said he would. He explained absences before they became gaps. He stayed present instead of impressive. Those were good signs. But good signs weren't guarantees. One afternoon, as rain streaked down the cafe windows, Ethan sat with his hands wrapped around his coffee, staring into it without drinking. Marissa noticed the stillness first, the way his shoulders held tension even while his face stayed calm. "You're somewhere else," she said. He looked up. "I didn't realize it showed." "It does," she replied, "to people who are paying attention." He smiled faintly. "That might be the problem. I'm not used to people paying attention for the right reasons." "What are the wrong reasons?" she asked. "Utility," he said. "Expectation, access, and the right ones." "Presence," he answered after a pause. "Without demand." Marissa leaned against the counter. "That's rare." "It shouldn't," he said. "No," she agreed, "but rarity doesn't make something less necessary." The truth beneath the exchange was simple and instructive. People often confuse being needed with being valued. Ethan had lived most of his adult life being needed, being valued, without leverage, without expectation, felt unfamiliar. Later that evening, as they walked, he said, "Do you ever feel guilty for wanting stability?" Marissa considered that. "I used to. I thought it meant I was afraid of growth. And now? Now I think stability is what allows growth to happen safely," she said. "Without it, everything feels like survival." Ethan nodded. "I've confused momentum for growth more times than I can count." "That's common," she said gently. "Movement feels productive, even when it's just avoidance." They walked in silence after that. Not empty, not heavy, just thoughtful. That night, Ethan went home and didn't turn on the television. He didn't open his laptop. He sat with the quiet and noticed how uncomfortable it still made him. That discomfort, he realized, wasn't absence. It was adjustment. Memory has a way of rewriting itself when you're not watching. Marissa realized this one evening while standing alone behind the cafe counter after closing. She was wiping down the surface slowly, thinking about a relationship from years ago. One she had once described as peaceful. She could see now that peaceful hadn't been accurate. It had been unchallenged. She remembered how proud she'd been of not asking questions, of being easy, of not needing reassurance. At the time, it had felt mature. In hindsight, it felt lonely. When Ethan walked in just before closing, she was already halfway through that realization. "You're quiet," he said. "So are you," she replied. He took his usual seat. "I've been thinking about how people remember things differently once they know how they end." Marissa smiled slightly. "That's because memory isn't a record. It's a coping mechanism." He raised an eyebrow. "You've thought about this before." "I've lived it," she said. "I used to remember my past relationship as safe. Now I remember how much I edited myself to keep it that way." Ethan absorbed that. "I think I do the opposite," he said. "I remember my past relationships as demanding, so I don't have to look at how unavailable I was. The recognition between them was quiet but significant. Educational truth surfaced clearly here. We reshape memory to protect our self-image. They walked together after closing, the night cool and forgiving. Do you think people can love each other honestly while still being afraid? Ethan asked. Yes, Marissa said. I think that's most people. And does fear always ruin it? No, she replied. But pretending fear isn't there usually does. They stopped at her building. Whatever this is, Marissa said carefully, I don't want it built on unspoken assumptions. Ethan nodded. Neither do I. And that means, she continued, if you feel yourself pulling away, I'd rather hear about it than guess. He met her gaze. I can do that. She didn't ask for promises. She didn't offer them either. Promises made too early often became pressure later. As Ethan walked away, he felt something unfamiliar but grounding settle into him. Not excitement, not anxiety. Responsibility, not to impress, not to perform, but to remain visible. And Marissa, watching him disappear down the street, felt something equally important take shape. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't bracing for loss. She was preparing for truth. The first real tension didn't come from absence. It came from proximity. Marissa noticed it on a quiet afternoon when Ethan stayed longer than usual, his phone face down on the counter, untouched. They weren't talking. They didn't need to, but the silence had changed shape. It no longer felt observational. It felt weighted, like something unspoken was leaning in, asking to be acknowledged. She had learned to recognize that feeling. It was the moment before patterns revealed themselves. You look like you're deciding something, she said. Ethan smiled faintly. I was hoping it didn't show. It does, she replied. You just don't realize how much yet. He turned the cup slowly in his hands. I'm trying to figure out how much of myself to bring into this. Marissa didn't soften the truth. That's not something you decide once. No, he agreed. It's something you keep choosing. The educational truth surfaced quietly but firmly. Consistency is not intensity repeated. It's effort sustained. Ethan had always been good at effort, in short, powerful bursts. Staying present over time was different. It required less control and more tolerance for discomfort. That night, he invited her somewhere that wasn't the cafe, wasn't her neighborhood, and wasn't part of his polished world either. A bookstore. It was small, cramped, and dimly lit. The kind of place where shelves bowed slightly under the weight of used paperbacks. Marissa smiled the moment she walked in. This tells me more about you than any event ever could, she said. He laughed quietly. That's why I brought you here. They wandered the aisles without direction. Ethan lingered over margins, filled with notes from strangers long gone. Marissa flipped through dog-eared novels she'd loved once and forgotten. This place feels honest, she said, because it doesn't pretend to be new. Ethan replied. It just survives. She looked at him then, That what you're doing? The question wasn't sharp, just curious. Yes, he said after a moment. I think I have been. They left with nothing purchased, hands brushing accidentally as they stepped back into the street. Neither of them commented on it. Some moments didn't need interpretation. Later that week, Ethan missed a call while he was with her. He noticed it immediately. The name on the screen was unfamiliar to Marissa, but clearly significant to him. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. You don't have to ignore it, she said. I know, he replied, choosing not to. That choice mattered. But did what followed? The next morning, he arrived at the cafe distracted. His attention split despite his best efforts. Marissa noticed the shift without reacting to it. Something changed, she said. Yes, he admitted. I didn't handle it well. She waited. There are expectations attached to me, he continued. Old ones. People who assume access because it's always been granted. And did you grant it? She asked. He shook his head. No. But saying no came with consequences. Marissa nodded. It always does. What do you do when doing the right thing costs you comfort? He asked. She answered without hesitation. You decide whether comfort has been protecting you or limiting you. That landed harder than she intended. Ethan didn't speak for a long time after that. The cafe noise filled the space between them, ordinary and grounding. Eventually, he said, I don't know how to live without insulation yet. You don't have to tear it down all at once, Marissa said. You just have to stop pretending it's the same as safety. The invitation came again. This time, Ethan didn't hide it. He brought it with him, sliding it across the counter toward Marissa, like something fragile. I was asked to host, he said. Not attend. Host. She studied the envelope, elegant and understated. And I don't know what to do, he admitted, because this isn't just an appearance. It's a statement. A statement to whom? She asked. To everyone who expects me to remain untouchable. Marissa leaned against the counter. What would it mean if you didn't? It would mean I'm changing, he said. Publicly, she met his eyes. Change always becomes public, eventually. The educational truth was unmistakable here. You can't grow privately while living publicly. Eventually, the two collide. Ethan exhaled slowly. Would you come with me? The question surprised her, not because of the event, but because of what it implied. I don't belong in that world, she said honestly. I know, he replied. That's why I'm asking. Not to make you fit, but to stop pretending I can keep them separate. Marissa didn't answer immediately. She considered the weight of visibility, the risk of being misread, the cost of stepping into someone else's context. This isn't about luxury, she said finally. It's about whether you'll stand beside me the same way they're as you do here?" "Yes," he said, no hesitation. She studied him. "And if you don't, then you'll know exactly who I am," he replied. "That mattered." She nodded once. "Then I'll come," not because she was ready, but because clarity required exposure. As they stood there, both understood something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about trust anymore. It was about alignment. And alignment, once tested, could not be undone. Marissa didn't sleep well the night before the event, not because she was nervous about the clothes or the setting, but because she understood what visibility cost. Once you were seen in someone else's world, you couldn't pretend ignorance anymore. You couldn't unsee the rules, the hierarchies, the quiet expectations disguised as elegance. She stood in front of her mirror longer than usual, studying herself with an unfamiliar question in mind. Who am I when I step into a space that wasn't built for me? When Ethan arrived to pick her up, he didn't comment on how she looked. He didn't need to. His attention was steady, not evaluative. That alone calmed her. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly before they left. "I know," she replied, "but choosing not to see something doesn't protect me from it." He nodded. "That's one of the things I'm still learning." The venue was luminous in a restrained way. Soft lighting, controlled music, conversations that floated just above a whisper. Everything about the space was designed to impress without appearing to try. Marissa felt it immediately. The subtle recalibration of posture, the way people's eyes assessed before acknowledging, the unspoken language of belonging. Ethan sensed it. He stayed close, not possessively, but deliberately. His presence beside her wasn't a shield. It was a statement. Still, Marissa noticed how easily he moved through the room, how people approached him with familiarity, expectation, entitlement. He responded with practiced ease, offering attention without vulnerability, charm without access. This was the version of him she had only glimpsed, and it unsettled her more than she expected. The educational truth formed quietly, but clearly. People are shaped by the rooms they spend the most time in. At one point, Ethan stepped away briefly to speak with a donor. Marissa stood alone near the edge of the room, observing. A woman approached her, polished, confident, curious. "You must be new," the woman said pleasantly. Marissa smiled. The woman glanced toward Ethan. "He usually keeps his personal life separate." Marissa felt the words more than she heard them. "I'm aware," she replied calmly. The woman smiled, but there was calculation behind it. "Just be careful. This world has a way of consuming people." Marissa nodded. "So does any world that mistakes access for intimacy." The woman blinked, then excused herself. When Ethan returned, Marissa didn't mention the exchange. She didn't need to. The information was already filed where it belonged. On the drive home, Silence settled between them. Not tense, but thoughtful. I didn't realize how much of myself I leave behind when I'm there, Ethan said eventually. Marissa looked at him. I didn't realize how much of you disappears when you're comfortable. He absorbed that without defensiveness. That wasn't easy, he said. No, she agreed. But it was honest. They stopped outside her building. The city felt quieter here, less rehearsed. I don't regret going, Marissa said, but I won't pretend it didn't show me something. What? Ethan asked. That if we're going to work, she said carefully, it won't be because I adapt to your world. It will be because you stop disappearing in it. He nodded. That's fair. They stood there, neither reaching for reassurance. Sometimes clarity was enough. The days after the event felt different. Not strained, but exposed. Marissa noticed how the memory of the night lingered, not as jealousy or insecurity, but as awareness. She had seen Ethan in his most fluent environment. She had seen what he had learned to trade for acceptance. And Ethan had seen himself through her eyes. That was harder. He arrived at the cafe earlier than usual one morning, before the rush, before distraction could soften the moment. I don't want to live two lives, he said without preamble. Marissa looked up from the counter. Then don't, he exhaled. It's not that simple. No, she agreed, but it is that clear. He leaned forward slightly. I've been rewarded my entire life for being unavailable. People trust me because I don't need them. And now, she asked, and now I'm realizing that's not trust, he said. That's control. The educational truth was unmistakable here. Control can look like stability until intimacy exposes it. Marissa said nothing. She let the realization belong to him. I don't know how to dismantle that overnight, Ethan continued, but I don't want to keep building on it either. She met his gaze. Then start with consistency. Not gestures, not declarations. I can do that, he said. And when you fail, I'll name it, he replied, instead of hiding it. That mattered more than perfection. They didn't define anything that morning. They didn't label what they were building. They simply stayed. And in that staying, imperfect, visible, unfinished, both of them learned something quietly profound. Love didn't ask for transformation. It asked for presence. And presence, once chosen, had a way of reshaping everything else. If this chapter made you think about how power and comfort can quietly change people, especially in relationships, take a moment to like this video. It helps stories like this reach others who are learning the same lessons. And if you want to continue with Ethan and Marissa, because what was revealed in luxury will now be tested in everyday life, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. The next chapter explores what happens when presence becomes harder than absence. The change didn't announce itself with conflict. It arrived disguised as effort. Ethan began rearranging his days, not dramatically, not in ways anyone else would notice, but enough that it cost him something. Meetings were shortened instead of expanded. Invitations were declined without excuses attached. He started choosing places and people instead of letting his calendar choose for him. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, everything did. Marissa noticed it first in his energy. He was more present, but also more tired. The kind of tiredness that came from resisting old reflexes rather than indulging them. She recognized it because she'd lived it before, when growth demanded more awareness than comfort was willing to give. "You look like you're carrying something," she said one afternoon as she set his coffee down. "I am," Ethan replied. "My habits are arguing with me." She smiled slightly. Habits usually do when they realize they're no longer in charge. He exhaled. "I didn't realize how much of my identity was built on being available to everyone, except myself." "That's common," she said. "Being needed can feel safer than being known." The educational truth settled gently, but firmly. People often confuse usefulness with worth. Ethan had built a life where his worth was constantly validated through results, influence, access. What he was learning now was quieter and far more destabilizing. Presence didn't come with applause. It came with exposure. The first real test followed sooner than either of them expected. Ethan received a call one morning while sitting across from Marissa at the cafe. He glanced at the screen and hesitated. A familiar name, one tied to a project that had once defined his sense of relevance. He let it ring. Then he turned the phone face down. Marissa noticed the tension in his jaw. "You don't have to prove anything," she said calmly. "I know," he replied. "That's what makes this harder." When the call ended, the silence lingered. "That used to be automatic," he admitted. "Answering, engaging, managing. And now?" she asked. "Now I'm choosing not to," he said. "But part of me is afraid of what happens if I keep doing that." "What are you afraid of losing?" He thought for a moment. "Identity, influence, relevance." "What are you afraid of gaining?" He met her eyes. "Countability." She nodded. "That's heavier." "Yes," he said, "but it's also real." Marissa, for her part, was learning something too. Consistency didn't erase fear. It clarified it. The more Ethan showed up, the more she had to confront her own reflexes. The urge to stay guarded. The temptation to keep emotional distance, even when it was no longer necessary. One evening, after closing, she said, "I'm not used to people adjusting their lives for me." Ethan looked at her. "Does that make you uncomfortable?" "Yes," she admitted, "because it raises expectations." "And expectations scare you," he said gently. "They used to disappoint me," she replied. "I learned to lower them so I wouldn't feel foolish." He nodded. And now, I'm learning that low expectations don't protect you, she said. They just keep you from asking for what you need. The educational truth emerged clearly. Avoiding disappointment often means avoiding fulfillment. They walked in silence after that. The city, calm around them. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle somewhere deep. He had spent years avoiding accountability because it felt like pressure. But here it was, not imposed, not demanded, chosen. The distance crept back in quietly, not through absence, but through strain. Ethan began traveling more again, not by choice, but by consequence. Projects he'd delayed resurfaced. People pushed harder when they sensed his attention shifting elsewhere. He communicated. He explained. He stayed in touch. But Marissa felt it anyway. The thinning of presence. The way his focus stretched just a little too far to remain steady. She didn't accuse him. She watched. One night, after a long day, she said, "You don't disappear completely. You just arrive in pieces." Ethan didn't deny it. "I'm trying to be in 2 places at once." "And how is that going?" He smiled faintly. "Poorly." She stopped walking. "Ethan, I don't need exclusivity. I need coherence." That word struck him. Coherence. "I don't know how to do that yet," he said honestly. "That's okay," she replied, "as long as you don't pretend you are." They stood there, both aware that effort alone wasn't enough. Change required integration, not sacrifice, not performance. Integration. As they resumed walking, Ethan understood something that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. This wasn't about choosing between 2 lives. It was about learning how to live one honestly. And that lesson, he knew, was only beginning. The strain didn't break anything. That was the problem. If it had, Marissa would have known what to do. She understood endings that arrived with clarity. Sharp words, final decisions, unmistakable exits. What unsettled her was this in-between state, where effort existed alongside erosion, where no one could point to a single mistake, but the weight still accumulated. Ethan was trying. That truth complicated everything. He still came to the cafe, still walked her home when he could, still listened, carefully, attentively. But something in him felt divided again, not by secrecy this time, but by exhaustion, the kind that came from holding competing responsibilities without choosing which deserved primacy. Marissa noticed it in the pauses before his responses, in the way his eyes sometimes tracked movement beyond her when they spoke, in how his laughter arrived half a second late. "You're tired," she said one evening. "Yes," he admitted, "but not the kind sleep fixes." She understood that too well. They sat on a low wall near her building, city noise humming around them like static. Ethan rested his elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped. "I thought integration meant balance," he said. "I didn't realize it meant loss." "Loss of what?" Marissa asked. "Control," he replied. "The illusion that I could manage everything without anything pushing back. She nodded. Control always pushes back, eventually. It just chooses its timing. The educational truth surfaced again. Quiet but insistent. What we refuse to prioritize will eventually deprioritize us. Ethan stared at the pavement. I'm afraid I'll fail at this, he said. Not because I don't care, but because I care and still don't know how to reorganize my life around it. Marissa listened carefully before responding. Failure isn't always leaving, she said. Sometimes it's staying halfway. That landed heavily. I don't want to do that to you, he said. I know, she replied, but wanting to avoid harm isn't the same as preventing it. They sat in silence, the space between them no longer neutral, but honest. The next few days were quieter, not distant, just restrained. Marissa felt herself pulling back, not in retaliation, but in self-preservation. She didn't want to overextend emotionally, while Ethan was still negotiating his capacity. She had learned that lesson painfully in the past. Staying fully available to someone who was partially present created imbalance that eventually felt like self-betrayal. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. You're quieter, he said one morning. So are you, she replied. That's not an answer, he said gently. No, she agreed. It's a mirror. He took that in without argument. I don't want you to shrink yourself while I figure this out, he said. I'm not shrinking, Marissa replied. I'm adjusting. There's a difference. She met his gaze. I won't compete with your life, but I also won't disappear inside it. The boundary wasn't dramatic. It was clear. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten, not defensively, but with recognition. This what accountability looked like when it wasn't loud, when it didn't threaten, but also didn't bend. That night, alone in his apartment, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his calendar and began canceling things without replacing them. Not everything, not recklessly, but deliberately. Each cancellation felt like a small grief. A relationship loosened, an expectation unmet, a version of himself quietly retired. He noticed how often he'd said yes out of habit, not alignment. How rarely he'd asked himself who benefited from his availability. By the time he finished, the calendar looked unfamiliar. Simpler, lighter, more exposed. And that exposure scared him. When Ethan showed up at the cafe the next day, he looked different. Not more relaxed, more present. I made space, he said. Marissa studied him. Space for what? For choice, he replied. Instead of reaction, she nodded slowly. That's a start. It might not be enough, he added. No, she said honestly, but it's real. They stood there, neither rushing toward reassurance, because this stage of growth didn't need promises. It needed observation. As Marissa went back to work, she felt something settle inside her. Not relief, not certainty, respect. And Ethan, watching her move through the cafe with quiet competence, understood something fundamental at last. Love didn't demand urgency, but it did demand alignment, and alignment required courage not just to feel, but to restructure the life around that feeling. That work had begun. Whether it would hold remained to be seen. The luxury world didn't reappear all at once. It seeped back in through details. Marissa noticed it first in the way people spoke to Ethan. When they ran into him outside the cafe, their tone shifted slightly. More careful, more impressed. Names were dropped. Invitations extended casually, as if attendance were assumed rather than requested. Ethan handled it smoothly. He always had. What's unsettled Marissa wasn't his ease. It was how quickly the environment adjusted around him, and how slowly it adjusted around her. One afternoon, as they sat together during a lull, a man stopped near the counter and greeted Ethan warmly. They spoke in shorthand, referencing projects and timelines Marissa didn't recognize. When the man left, he glanced at her briefly, polite but dismissive, as if she were part of the furniture rather than the conversation. Marissa waited until they were alone again. That happens a lot, doesn't it? She asked. Ethan didn't pretend not to understand. Yes, they don't see me, she said, not accusing, observing. No, he agreed. They see a gap they don't know how to place. And you? She asked. What do see? He met her eyes. I see how much of my life I've allowed to be designed without space for someone like you. The educational truth rose clearly here. Systems reveal who they were built for and who they were not. Marissa nodded. That's what worried me about the event, not the wealth. The architecture. Architecture? Ethan asked. The structure, she said. The assumptions. Who belongs without explanation. They sat in silence, the weight of that realization settling in. The breaking point didn't arrive through conflict. It arrived through contrast. A few nights later, Marissa agreed to meet Ethan briefly at a restaurant near his office. The place was refined, but impersonal. The kind of space designed to impress clients rather than welcome people. Ethan arrived late, apologetic, distracted. I got pulled into something, he said. I didn't want to cancel. I know, Marissa replied. But as the evening unfolded, she felt herself receding. Not emotionally, contextually. The conversation kept drifting toward his world. Negotiations, obligations, people she'd never meet, but who clearly mattered. Ethan noticed it too late. You're quiet, he said. I'm invisible, she replied calmly. The word hung between them. I didn't mean, he started. I know, she said. That makes it harder. No, didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply named the consequence. This isn't about effort anymore, Marissa continued. It's about fit, and I need to know whether you're willing to change the shape of your life, or if I'm expected to keep shrinking to fit into it. Ethan felt the full weight of that question land. Not as pressure, as truth. I don't want you to shrink, he said. Then I can't be the only one adapting, she replied. They left the restaurant quietly. On the walk outside, Ethan said, I thought integration meant letting you into my world. And now, she asked, and now I see it, also means letting my world change, because you're in it. That realization unsettled him more than anything else had. Later that night, Marissa sat alone in her apartment, lights low, the city murmuring outside her window. She replayed the evening, without embellishment, without fear. She wasn't angry. She was clear. She understood now that love didn't fail, only because people didn't care. Sometimes it failed because they cared, but not enough to restructure. Across the city, Ethan stood at his window again, city lights sharp and distant. He felt something he hadn't expected. Grief, not for Marissa, for the version of his life that could no longer exist unchanged. The quiet promise he'd been living by, that he could love without altering the foundations of his world, had finally been unmasked. Luxury hadn't been the secret. Inertia had. And the question now was unavoidable. Would he protect the structure that made him comfortable, dismantle parts of it to make room for something real? Ethan didn't sleep that night, not because his mind was racing, but because it was unusually still. The kind of stillness that arrived only when something fundamental had been named and could no longer be avoided. He replayed Marissa's words without softening them. Fit, shape, shrinking, they weren't accusations. They were observations. And that was what made them impossible to argue with. For years, Ethan had believed that love failed because people asked for too much. Too much time. Too much access. Too much emotional availability. He had told himself that wanting space was maturity, that independence was proof of balance. Now he saw the pattern more clearly. He hadn't protected balance. He'd protected convenience. And convenience, he was beginning to understand, was not neutral. It always benefited the person with the most power to disengage. Marissa woke the next morning with an unfamiliar calm. It wasn't relief. It wasn't resignation. It was alignment. She went through her routine without resistance. Coffee, shower, the short walk to the cafe. Her body felt lighter, not because anything had been resolved, but because she had stopped negotiating with herself. She had named what she needed. Whatever came next would either meet it or make the answer clear. When Ethan arrived, just before closing, she wasn't surprised. He looked different, not rushed, not distracted, intentional. I want to talk, he said. She nodded. Then talk. They sat at the counter after the last customer left, the cafe quiet in a way that felt earned. I realized something last night, Ethan began. I've been asking whether you fit into my life instead of asking whether my life makes room for you. Marissa listened without interruption. I thought love was about adding someone without subtraction, he continued. But that only works if what you're adding doesn't challenge what's already there. And I do, she said calmly. Yes, he replied. You do? He took a breath. I don't want to keep you at the edge of my world. And I don't want to ask you to step into it unchanged. That means I have decisions to make. Marissa studied him carefully. Decisions aren't the same as declarations. I know, he said. That's why I'm not asking you for reassurance. What are you asking for? Time, he answered. Not to delay, but to restructure. She considered that. How much time? She asked. I don't know yet, he said honestly. But I know this. I won't keep living in a way that requires you to feel invisible. The educational truth surfaced clearly here. Awareness without action becomes another form of avoidance. Marissa leaned back slightly. Then here's mine, she said. I won't wait in uncertainty while someone decides whether I'm worth changing for. That's fair, he replied immediately. She nodded. So whatever you do, do it because it's right for you. Not because you're afraid of losing me. Ethan absorbed that quietly. They didn't touch. They didn't promise. They sat in the honesty of the moment, without trying to soothe it. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not empty. Ethan didn't disappear. He didn't overcompensate either. He began making visible changes, not performative ones, not symbolic gestures, but structural ones. He delegated power instead of hoarding it. He stepped back from roles that existed only to affirm his relevance. He allowed certain relationships to fade without replacing them immediately. Each decision cost him something. Status, the comfort of being indispensable. But with each loss, something else emerged. Space. Marissa watched without intervening. She didn't praise him. She didn't monitor him. She allowed his choices to stand on their own weight. One evening, as they walked together again, she said, "You seem different." "So do you," he replied. "How?" "You're not bracing anymore," he said. "You're present." She smiled faintly. "Because I'm not negotiating my worth in silence." He nodded. "I don't ever want to put you there again." "I know," she said, "but knowing isn't the same as remembering." They stopped outside her building. "I'm not asking for perfection," Marissa said. "I'm asking for coherence. One life, one direction." Ethan met her gaze. "That's what I'm building now." She searched his face, not for certainty, but for congruence. And for the first time since this had begun, what she saw aligned. Not finished, but honest. As Ethan walked away, he felt the weight of what he was choosing. Not just Marissa, but a different relationship with himself. And Marissa, watching him go, understood something quietly profound. Love didn't become real when someone promised to stay. It became real when someone was willing to change the life that made leaving easy. Change didn't feel triumphant. That surprised Ethan. He had expected relief, maybe even a sense of arrival, once he began dismantling the parts of his life that no longer aligned with who he wanted to be. Instead, what he felt was quieter and heavier, like standing in a house after the furniture had been moved out, realizing how much space echoed when it was no longer filled with habit. He had underestimated how much of his identity had been reinforced by momentum, by the constant forward motion that made stopping feel irresponsible. Now, with fewer meetings and less noise, the silence pressed closer. It asked questions he couldn't defer. Who was he when he wasn't needed? Who remained when usefulness was no longer the currency? Those questions followed him into the cafe one late afternoon, where Marissa was wiping down the counter with her usual care. She looked up when he entered, reading his expression the way she always did. Not for drama, but for truth. "You look unsettled," she said. "I am," he admitted, "but not in the way I expected." She nodded. Growth usually feels like loss before it feels like alignment. "That's the part no one warns you about," he said. "They do," she replied gently. "We just don't listen when comfort is still working." The educational truth settled quietly between them. Growth removes familiar coping mechanisms before it offers new stability. They sat together without urgency, the cafe slowly emptying around them. Ethan watched Marissa move through the space with practiced ease, how she didn't rush transitions or avoid stillness. She inhabited moments instead of managing them. "I used to think stillness was wasted time," he said. "And now?" "And now I think it's where you hear yourself clearly enough to change." She smiled faintly. "That's because stillness doesn't distract you from consequence." Marissa, for her part, was navigating her own adjustment. Ethan's changes had been real, observable, structural, costly. And yet, she felt the old reflex stirring, the instinct to remain prepared for disappointment, even when evidence suggested otherwise. She didn't want to punish him for the past, but she also didn't want to forget it. One evening, as they walked, she said, "I'm learning how to stay open without abandoning caution." Ethan glanced at her. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said honestly, "but it's healthier than closing myself off or pretending I'm unaffected." He nodded. "I don't want you to feel like you have to guard yourself with me." "I know," she replied, "but trust isn't something I turn on all at once. It's something I update." That landed with precision. "Update?" he repeated. "Not reset." "Yes," she said. "Resetting ignores what happened. Updating integrates it." The lesson was clear. Healing doesn't erase memory. It teaches you how to use it wisely. The real test came quietly. Ethan received an offer he had once dreamed of, an opportunity that promised influence without proximity, success without daily involvement. It would allow him to maintain his status, while avoiding the exhausting demands he had begun shedding. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it would require returning to the very compartmentalization he was trying to leave behind. He didn't tell Marissa right away, not out of secrecy, but out of uncertainty. He needed to understand his own reaction before involving her. When he finally did tell her, they were sitting on a bench near the cafe, the evening light softening the edges of the street. "I was offered something," he said. Marissa didn't tense. She listened. "Tell me about it." He explained the offer plainly. No embellishment, no justification. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Does it bring you closer to the life you're trying to build, or further away?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, because the truth was uncomfortable. "It brings me closer to who I used to be," he said finally. "Not who I'm becoming." She nodded. "Then you already know what the decision is." He smiled faintly. "Knowing isn't the same as choosing." "No," she agreed, "but choosing is the part that teaches you who you really are." They sat in silence after that, not heavy, not strained, just honest. And Ethan understood something he hadn't before. The most dangerous temptations weren't the ones that offered chaos. They were the ones that offered comfort without growth. As the light faded and the streetlights flickered on, he felt the weight of an approaching choice, not imposed by Marissa, not demanded by circumstance, but required by alignment. And alignment, once recognized, no longer allowed excuses. Ethan didn't accept the offer right away. That alone felt like progress. In the past, he would have decided quickly, efficiently, mistaking decisiveness for clarity. Now he let the question sit with him. He lived alongside it for several days, noticing how his body reacted each time he imagined saying yes. Tightness in his chest, a familiar rush of justification, the quiet relief of not having to change anything else. Those reactions told him more than logic ever could. When he finally spoke to Marissa about it again, it wasn't to ask for advice. "I think I understand why it appeals to me," he said. She looked at him, attentive. "Why?" "Because it would let me feel accomplished without being fully present," he replied. "It rewards distance." Marissa nodded slowly. "Distance has always paid you well." "Yes," he said, "but it's also cost me more than I admitted." The educational truth surfaced clearly here. Just because something works doesn't mean it's working for you. He declined the offer the following morning. Not dramatically, not publicly. He simply said no. The fallout wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. A few calls went unanswered. A few assumptions shifted. The world he'd once moved through effortlessly adjusted to his absence without ceremony. That surprised him most of all. He had spent years believing his withdrawal would cause disruption. Instead, it created space. Marissa felt the change before Ethan told her, not because he announced it, but because his presence settled. There was less tension in him now, less scanning, less quiet negotiation happening behind his eyes. "You chose," she said, one evening, as they walked. "Yes," he replied. She didn't ask what he'd chosen. She didn't need to. "I'm proud of you," she said. Not warmly, not romantically. Honestly, that mattered more. But pride didn't erase reality. As Ethan's life simplified, Marissa's didn't automatically expand to meet it. She still had her routines, her work, her own carefully constructed boundaries. She wasn't waiting to be absorbed into his world or to absorb him into hers. That was the point. One night, sitting together on the steps outside her building, she said, "I want to be clear about something." He turned toward her. "Okay, I don't want to be the reason you change," she said. "I want to be part of the life you're choosing anyway." Ethan understood the distinction immediately. "If I change for you," he said, "resentment will follow. If I change for alignment, you're not a threat. You're a companion." She smiled faintly. Exactly. The lesson deepened. Love can support growth, but it cannot replace self-direction. The shift between them became subtle but undeniable. They no longer felt like they were negotiating the future. They were inhabiting the present. They shared ordinary moments without interpreting them as proof or promise. Coffee after closing, walks that ended without ceremony, silences that didn't require filling. One afternoon, Marissa said, "I used to think stability meant nothing changing. And now," Ethan asked, "and now I think it means change that doesn't destabilize you," she said. "Change you can stand inside." Ethan nodded. "That's what this feels like." They didn't name what they were becoming. They didn't rush to define it, because definition had never been their problem. Avoidance had been, and avoidance no longer had room to hide. As they stood there, watching the city settle into evening, both understood something quietly but clearly. The chaos they'd feared hadn't arrived. What had arrived instead was responsibility, the kind that didn't demand perfection, only presence. And presence, once sustained, began to feel less like effort and more like home. Marissa noticed the difference first in herself. She wasn't bracing anymore. That realization arrived one quiet morning as she unlocked the cafe door and stepped inside before sunrise. The lights flickered on, the familiar smell of coffee grounds and cleaning solution settling around her. She moved through the routine, setting chairs, checking supplies, without the low hum of anticipation she'd grown used to carrying. There was no question forming in her mind, no silent calculation, no preparation for disappointment. Thou absence startled her. For years, she had believed vigilance was a form of wisdom, that staying slightly guarded meant staying safe. Now, without the need to scan for signs of withdrawal, she felt exposed in a different way. Not unsafe, unpracticed. Ethan arrived later that morning, earlier than usual, carrying nothing but himself. No phone in hand. no urgency in his posture. He took his seat and waited while she finished with another customer. "You look lighter," he said when she joined him. "So do you," she replied. He smiled. "That feels earned." She considered that. But lightness, she was learning, didn't mean everything was resolved. It meant there was enough stability to notice what still needed attention. "I've been thinking," Marissa said, wiping the counter slowly, "about how easy it is to misidentify the real problem in relationships." Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" "We think the problem is conflict," she said, "or distance, or even fear. But usually it's avoidance. Quiet avoidance." He nodded. "Avoidance dressed up as independence." "Yes," she said. "Or maturity." The educational truth surfaced clearly. Avoidance feels safe because it delays discomfort, but it compounds it. Ethan leaned back slightly. "I've avoided more than conflict," he admitted. "I've avoided hope. Because hope demands follow-through." Marissa met his gaze. "And follow-through demands consistency." They sat with that. The test that followed didn't come from Ethan's world. It came from hers. Marissa's mother called unexpectedly one afternoon, her voice carrying the familiar mix of concern and distance. They spoke briefly about work, about weather, about things that didn't risk vulnerability. After hanging up, Marissa felt the old ache resurface, the quiet longing for a kind of emotional availability she'd learned not to ask for too directly. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. "You okay?" he asked as they walked later that evening. "Yes," she said automatically. Then stopped herself. "No, not really." He waited. "My mother and we're close in theory," Marissa said, "but we avoid anything that might ask too much of either of us." Ethan nodded. "That sounds familiar. I learned early that asking for more didn't get me more," she continued. "It just made people uncomfortable. And so you learned to self-contain," he said. "Yes," she replied. "And I'm realizing that habit didn't stop at family." The lesson pressed inward now, personal and precise. Patterns learned in childhood often masquerade as personality in adulthood. They stopped walking. "I don't want repeat that pattern here," Marissa said quietly. "I don't want to stay silent, just because speaking might complicate things." Ethan met her seriousness with equal steadiness. "Then don't. That requires trust," she said. "Yes," he replied. "And trust requires risk." She nodded. "I know." Later that night, Marissa lay awake, thinking not about Ethan, but about herself. About how often she'd chosen self-sufficiency over connection. How easily she'd convinced herself that not needing much was the same as being strong. She saw now that strength also meant asking, not demanding, not testing, Howgie. The next morning, when Ethan arrived at the cafe, she didn't ease into the conversation. I need to tell you something, she said. He straightened slightly. Okay, I'm still learning how to ask for what I need, she continued. And sometimes I won't get it right. Sometimes I'll pull back instead of speaking up. Ethan listened without interrupting. If that happens, she said, I don't want you to assume I'm fine. He nodded. I won't, and I'll work on saying it sooner, she added. That's all I could ask for, he said. They didn't hold hands. They didn't move closer. They didn't need to. What passed between them was quieter and more durable than reassurance. It mutual responsibility. And that, both of them understood, was the difference between love that survived and love that simply endured. There was a strange honesty in the quiet that followed Marissa's confession. Nothing needed to be fixed. Nothing rushed to be resolved. Ethan didn't respond with reassurance or urgency, and Marissa didn't feel the familiar pull to soften what she'd said. The truth sat between them without demand. That was new. In the days that followed, Marissa practiced something that felt almost unnatural. Speaking sooner. Not dramatically. Not perfectly. Just earlier than she used to. When Ethan arrived late one afternoon, she didn't tell herself a story about why. She asked, "Long day?" She said, "Yes," he replied. "I should have told you I'd be late. Thank you for saying that," she said. "It helps." He nodded. "I'm learning that information isn't pressure. It's respect." That sentence stayed with her. The educational truth was becoming personal now. Clarity doesn't control people. It frees them from unnecessary interpretation. Ethan, too, was learning where his habits still surfaced. He noticed how quickly he wanted to retreat when things felt emotionally exposed. How his instinct was still to manage instead of engage, to smooth instead of sit with discomfort. One evening, while they walked without destination, he said, "I still want to disappear sometimes." Marissa didn't react. When things feel steady, he said, where there's nothing to solve. She considered that because steadiness requires you to stay. Yes, he admitted, and staying means I can't hide behind motion. She nodded. I understand that urge more than you think. They stopped at a corner, waiting for the light to change. I used to leave emotionally before people could, Marissa said. I told myself it was independence. And now? Ethan asked. And I know it was fear, she replied. Fear that if I stayed fully present, I'd have more to lose. The light changed. They crossed slowly. That night, Ethan returned to his apartment and noticed something quietly significant. It didn't feel empty anymore. Not because Marissa was there, but because he no longer felt like he was waiting to leave it. The real clarity came without ceremony. One afternoon, Marissa closed the cafe early due to a power issue. She texted Ethan without thinking. not to explain, but to share. Closed early, walking home. His reply came quickly. Want company? She paused, not out of hesitation, but awareness. Then typed back, yes. They walked together through the early evening light. The city softer than usual. No agenda, no discussion waiting to happen. At one point, Marissa said, I used to think love was about endurance. Ethan looked at her. Enduring what? Uncertainty, she said. Distance. Discomfort. And now I think love is about clarity, she said. Even when clarity is uncomfortable. He nodded. Especially then. They stopped near her building. Neither in a hurry. I don't feel like I'm performing anymore, Ethan said quietly. Not for you, not for myself. Marissa smiled, not widely, but genuinely. Neither do I. They stood there, the moment complete, without needing to be extended. What they had reached wasn't certainty. It was alignment. And alignment, they were learning, didn't guarantee permanence, but it made honesty possible. As Ethan walked away, he understood something that would have frightened him months ago. He wasn't afraid of losing Marissa anymore. He was afraid of losing himself again. And that fear, unlike the others, was worth listening to. The change didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a settling. Marissa noticed it on an ordinary morning, the kind that once would have passed without reflection. The cafe opened on time. The coffee brewed without incident. The city outside moved at its usual pace. And yet, something inside her was different. She wasn't waiting for the other moment. Not the shoe to drop. Not the silence to grow heavy. Not the gradual thinning of presence she had learned to anticipate. She simply there. Ethan arrived mid-morning. Not rushed, not early, not apologetic, just present. He took his seat and watched her work for a moment before speaking. I realized something, he said. She glanced at him. You say that a lot lately. Yes, he smiled faintly. Because I stopped outrunning myself. She nodded, understanding immediately. I used to believe peace came from control, he continued, from keeping everything contained. But it turns out peace comes from coherence, living one life, she said. Yes, he replied, even when it costs more. They didn't dramatize the statement. They didn't need to. The cost had already been paid in smaller ways. Choices made quietly, habits broken slowly, identities adjusted without applause. That was the kind of work that lasted. The educational truth was clear now, not as a lesson, but as lived experience. Real growth is quiet, because it happens internally before it's ever visible. That evening, they walked together without destination, the city familiar enough to stop demanding attention. Streetlights flickered on. Conversations drifted past. Ordinary life unfolding without awareness of their internal shift. Do you ever miss who you were? Marissa asked. Ethan considered the question, honestly. Sometimes. But I don't miss how much effort it took to maintain that version. She smiled. I miss who I was, too. Sometimes. The one who thought self-sufficiency meant not needing anyone. Now? And now I know it just meant I didn't trust anyone to stay, she said, including myself. They stopped walking. This feels different, Ethan said. Yes, Marissa replied, because it isn't built on proving anything. They stood there, not touching, not reaching, not because the moment lacked intimacy, but because it didn't require reassurance. Later that night, Ethan returned to his apartment and noticed something small but significant. The space no longer felt temporary, not because it had changed, but because he had stopped treating it like a place he might abandon at any moment. He sat on the couch without checking his phone, without planning the next thing, without scanning for urgency. He simply stayed. Marissa, meanwhile, sat at her kitchen table, a mug warming her hands, thinking about how different this felt from the love she'd known before. There was no intensity to manage, no fear to negotiate, no version of herself she needed to maintain to remain acceptable. Just honesty, just effort, just presence. She understood now that love didn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. It needed to be consistent. When Ethan arrived the next morning, Marissa greeted him the same way she always had. Coffee? Yes, he said. Please. As she poured it, their hands brushed lightly, unremarkable, familiar, the kind of touch that didn't announce anything, because it didn't have to. They shared a look, quiet and mutual. This wasn't the end of uncertainty. It was the beginning of trust. And trust, they both knew, wasn't built in grand moments, but in the ordinary ones that followed, untested and unafraid. The clarity didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived with choice. Marissa understood that one quiet afternoon as she watched Ethan sit at the counter, reading without distraction, his coffee cooling beside him. There was no urgency in his posture, no sense that he was borrowing the moment until something more important arrived. He was where he said he would be. That was new enough to matter. She remembered how many times in the past she had accepted partial presence because it came wrapped in charm or intention. How often she'd told herself that understanding someone's limitations meant tolerating them indefinitely. Understanding, she knew now, wasn't permission. It was information. Ethan looked up and caught her watching him. He smiled, not performatively, not cautiously, just a small, genuine acknowledgement. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, she said. And this time, she didn't correct herself. Later that evening, they sat on the steps outside her building. The city quieter than usual. The air carried the smell of rain, even though the sky was clear. I want to say something, Ethan said. Marissa turned toward him. Then say it. I don't know what the future looks like, he said. I don't know how things will change or what new pressures will show up. But I do know this. If I ever start disappearing again, I want you to tell me." She studied him carefully. "What will you do if I do?" "I'll listen," he said. "Not defend, not explain it away. I'll listen." She nodded. "That's all I need." They sat in silence after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because nothing needed to be added. The educational truth that had been forming since the beginning finally settled into place. Love isn't proven by promises about the future. It's proven by how people respond when the present becomes uncomfortable. Months passed, not marked by milestones, but by continuity. Ethan didn't become a different man overnight. He still struggled with old reflexes, still felt the pull of his former life at unexpected moments. But now, when it happened, he named it instead of hiding it. Marissa didn't become fearless. She still felt the urge to withdraw when things felt too steady, too open. But now, she spoke before silence turned into distance. They learned each other in real time, not through intensity, not through sacrifice, through adjustment. Some mornings, Ethan didn't come to the cafe. Some evenings, Marissa chose solitude instead of company. Nothing fractured because of it. Nothing needed repairing. There was room. One night, as they walked without destination, Marissa said, "I think this is the first time I've been in something that doesn't require me to disappear to keep the peace." Ethan nodded. This is the first time peace hasn't felt like avoidance. They stopped beneath a streetlight, the glow soft and imperfect. "This isn't perfect," Marissa said. "No," Ethan agreed, "but it's honest." That was enough. On a morning that felt no different from any other, Marissa poured Ethan's coffee and set it in front of him. He took a sip, then smiled. "Still bitter," he said. "Some things don't need fixing," she replied. He laughed quietly. They sat there together, the cafe filling slowly, the world continuing without pause. There was sense of waiting, no fear of collapse, no illusion that love had solved everything. Just two people, aware of their patterns, choosing each other with intention instead of impulse. The quiet promise Ethan had lived by for years, that he could love without changing, had finally been replaced. Not by luxury, not by sacrifice, but a deeper truth. Love didn't ask him to abandon his life. It asked him to live it fully, without hiding. And Marissa, who had once believed safety meant expecting less, now understood something just as clearly. Love didn't require her to endure uncertainty. It required her to stay visible, even when staying felt vulnerable. They didn't call it a happy ending. They didn't need to, because what they had built wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, quiet, intentional, and strong enough to last. If this final chapter resonated with you, if you've ever learned that love isn't proven by promises, but by presence, please take a moment to like this video. It helps this story reach others who may need this reminder. And if you believe love stories should be honest, reflective, and rooted in real-life lessons, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. More stories like this are coming. Stories about choosing clarity, presence, and growth.